We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Epic. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.
Hi, I'm Katie Dean, Executive Editor of the Cap Times, and I'd like to welcome you to Cap Times Idea Fest 2021. This is the festival's 5th year, featuring both live and virtual sessions. Our theme this year is Reckoning with Change, and there's certainly been a lot of that. Staging Idea Fest is always a big lift, and we couldn't do it without Cap Times members. If you're not already, I hope you'll consider becoming one. Not only do members help shape events like this one, but they support an independent and trustworthy local media source at a critical time. Find details online at membership.captimes.com. Finally, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, as well as our numerous other sponsors. So please, enjoy this session. You'll find other festival videos at captimesideafest.com.
Hello, and welcome to this year's Cap Times Idea Fest. I'm Abigail Becker, and I'm the local government reporter with the Cap Times. A year after nationwide calls for justice for people of color disproportionately targeted by law enforcement, the City of Madison implemented a civilian oversight board, began the process for hiring an independent police monitor, and launched the city's first mobile crisis unit of unarmed first responders and mental health providers. At the same time, MPD has a brand new chief of police. Are they meeting their goals, and most importantly, the goals of the community? We've got a great group of panelists here today, so thank you all for joining us from near and far, and I'm excited to talk about all of these issues. So I've got a question for each of the panelists to start off, and then we're going to dive in a bit more onto all of these topics. So everyone, if you could also just share a little bit about your role in the community when you answer this first question, I think that would be a great way to start off. So why don't we start with Brandy here? So this past year has been difficult for many, and many community organizations have really stepped up to care for those here in the community. Urban Triage is rooted in providing transformational education and has now moved into the realm of direct services. I'd love to know from you, what needs have you seen arise over this past, year and a half, and how has Urban Triage really stepped in to care for everyone?
Yeah, so I'm gonna try to answer all your one question, but 5 questions in one. So yes, Urban Triage is founded and grounded in transformative education. That is the foundation of everything that we do in all of our services. And we have also increased our direct services. And the highest needs that we see right now in our community as a result of COVID and the compounded effects of COVID is rental assistance and housing, right? A few years ago, Scott Walker and a few lobbyists, a lot of lobbyists and a lot of money, changed our state laws on housing, which increased homelessness expeditiously in the Dane County area in Wisconsin. And when COVID hit, it compounded what we were seeing already happening in our community, higher rates, higher rental rates, lower wages. So Urban Triage recently has been awarded a $10.6 million contract with Dane County Human Services, and we're working with the City of Madison in collaboration with CAC, which is Community Action Coalition. That's what CAC stands for. And in partnership with them, we will be assisting and implementing a new rental assistance program for the Dane County area. So we're excited about that. But most importantly for us is a transformative piece. We have work groups, our Supporting Healthy Black Families work group, our Supporting Healthy Black Agriculture work group, our Supporting Healthy Black Youth work group, and our co-conspirator work group. And we also provide lots of consulting. We're doing a co-conspirator work group for Park Bank, and we're currently doing one for MMSD. So we're really excited for our work in our partnerships with systems and institutions.
Well, thank you for sharing all that. It's great to have you here today, Brandy. All right, so Chief Sean Barnes, welcome to Madison. You've been here for a little while, but welcome anyway. So earlier this year, you came to Madison as our Chief of Police. You know, you laid out at that time, in your words, I believe, what you called an ambitious blueprint for the city and the police department. So where are you in the department on some of these goals? Give us a brief overview here to start off.
Sure. Thank you, Abby, for having me. My name is Chief Sean Barnes of the Madison Police Department. I started officially on February 1, but unofficially back in December when I was appointed by the Police Fire Commission. Some of the things that we wanted to prioritize was community engagement, crime prevention, and employee safety and wellness. I think those are the three trifecta that every police department should have as its foundation. When it comes to crime prevention, we are just finishing our summer strategic plans, where I asked each commanding officer of a district to put together a strategic plan that would address your three crime problems for your particular district, as well as community engagement. And I think it went extremely well. Most of the districts were able to hit their metrics, and more importantly, our community engagement and communication with our community was increased exponentially. For example, there was one district that had over 300 hours of community engagement. And that's really what you need to put money in that bank of trust should you ever have to use it. When it comes to employee safety and wellness, we're still doing our wellness checks, which was approved by our city council, was also part of the recommendations from the ad hoc committee. And so I was able to get some feedback from our providers on that, and the officers like it. They want it to be expanded, and I think it's great when we put something in front of them that's different, and then they hold on to it, saying that we think that employee safety and wellness is really good for us. And of course, community engagement. We want to be a transparent police department. We want to be able to share data with our community, and more importantly, we want to truly engage the community. And that's more than just programs. It's taking the time to meet or talk to anyone who's interested. It's taking 2 minutes on every call to interact with our community, something that was started by my predecessor, and I want to continue that. And so the idea is that we have to reintroduce ourselves to our community. We have to reintroduce ourselves to Madison. You know, COVID hurt us. 1 year of non-face-to-face interaction, and indeed in some circles, we're still doing Zoom calls, right? And so we want to make sure that we can reintroduce ourselves to our community. We're here to serve.
Definitely. And for viewers who may be just getting to know you at this year's Idea Fest, just briefly, where did you previously work, and sort of what made you interested in working for Madison?
Sure, I'll try to keep this short, but I started my policing career in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is in the center of the state. It's a population similar to Madison, about 277,000 persons, with about 700 police officers. From there, I left and went to Salisbury, which is a little bedroom community just north of Charlotte. And from there, I worked at civilian oversight. I think I'm the only police chief who's worked in civilian oversight and is a police chief. In fact, I'm still very much connected with NACOL, and we were supposed to be on a panel for the IAC police conference, but it was canceled due to things that are going on down in New Orleans. But what attracted me to Madison was, throughout my entire career, I've always kind of felt like the black sheep of the family. I've always been open to change. I've never been resistant to change. I've always felt that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And what really attracted to me was the history of community policing and problem-oriented policing here in Madison. I was introduced to Herman Goldstein as a young police officer back in the early 2000s, and that became really the model of the way I police and the way I led my police departments. And to have an opportunity to come here to Madison and continue that legacy, I couldn't pass that up.
Well, thanks for sharing and thanks for being here. All right, well, let's move on to Keith Finley. So you've been a part of major efforts here in Madison behind new police accountability measures. And specifically, you were part of the group that issued 177, I believe, if I have that number right. Yep, 177 recommendations for the police department, including the creation of that civilian oversight board and independent police monitor. So where is Madison at with some of the cornerstone recommendations from that large report?
Sure, yeah, so I've been really privileged and honored to be a part of the sort of police reform and engagement efforts that have been going on in Madison at least for the last 6 years or more. We were ahead of the curve in terms of starting to work on these issues before the George Floyd killing and unrest, and before the Black Lives Matter movement reached its peak. And part of that was this ad hoc committee that I was a part of for 4 years, where we studied everything about the Madison Police Department with the help of a consulting report by a group from the OIR group from California. And we did ultimately produce a lengthy report, in-depth report with 177 specific recommendations for reform. The capstone recommendation was for the creation of an office of an independent police monitor who answers to a civilian oversight board. And I can't say that all 177 recommendations have been fully addressed yet. They haven't. There's a lot of work to be done on those. But even before we published our report, 2 years ago now, the police department had already taken active steps to implement many of them. Chief Barnes can probably tell you more about it than I can about what's happened since then, but I think that they've continued to make progress on some. Others I think they probably want to revisit or discuss further. But I'm really pleased that the city has, although it's taken a while, as politics tend to take in Madison, it has taken a while. The city has created the Civilian Oversight Board and the position of the independent police monitor. And I am now a member of that Civilian Oversight Board. We've been meeting for a number of months now, mostly doing organizational work, setting ourselves up, but also doing the heavy work, the very important work of hiring the independent monitor. And the candidates are in, the review process is ongoing. We hope to have an independent monitor in place in the fairly near future.
Great, and you're a professor at UW-Madison as well. Could you share a little bit about your field of study there?
Sure, yeah, I am a professor of law at UW-Madison at the law school, where I teach criminal procedure, I teach evidence, wrongful convictions, law and forensic science. I've been there for many, many years. I did spend about 6.5 years as a public defender in Madison. And in 1998, I co-founded the Wisconsin Innocence Project, which I co-directed for many years. And most recently, I've co-founded a new center called the Center for Integrity in Forensic Sciences.
That's right. Well, thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be here.
And Sarah, welcome to the panel. So last week was a milestone for a major initiative that you're a part of. Could you share with viewers what the Madison Cares program is and what that acronym stands for, and what it aims to do, and how it's been going for just the first couple of days here?
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Sarah Henriksen. I've been a crisis worker with Journey Mental Health for over 20 years, and I have been an embedded crisis worker with the Madison Police Department for about 5.5 years. So having a lot of experience being part of responding to people who are in a mental health emergency kind of set me up well to help with the evolution of the CARES program. So CARES stands for Community Alternative Resources Emergency Services, excuse me. So the impetus for this, and this is something that our community has been looking at for a long time, is the idea that we want to expand the continuum of emergency response in our community. That we recognize that we as a community, and I would argue as a society, have had an over-reliance on law enforcement as first responders to every kind of emergency that there is. And I think even most law enforcement officers would say that that there's an over-reliance on police to serve as many things besides, a public safety official or a law enforcement official, but also to be sort of de facto social workers and mental health responders and things like that, that are not necessarily within the scope of their expertise. And even when we have very well-trained police officers, when we send an armed, uniformed law enforcement officer to respond to someone who's having a behavioral health crisis, we add to the stigmatization of mental illness and the criminalization of behavioral health crises. And so that is kind of the foundation for why we wanted to have this new initiative in our community. So how it works is that we have a team consisting of a Madison Fire Department paramedic and a Journey crisis worker who are sent to behavioral health related calls for service that do not involve violence or weapons or things like that. And they are dispatched by the 911 center. So when someone calls into 911, either because they are having a behavioral health crisis or they are observing someone in the community who appears to be in need of an emergency response, or perhaps a loved one of someone in a mental health crisis, or a community provider, or anybody, then the dispatch, the 911 call taker can screen that call to determine if it meets the criteria for the CARES team to be dispatched in response to that behavioral health crisis. So initially, as this is just kind of phase one of a brand new initiative, we decided to start small. We looked at data from the Madison Police Department over the last couple years of when and where the highest volume of behavioral health calls for service were occurring. And based on that data, the pilot is running from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday in the Central District, so the downtown area of Madison. The goal long-term would be to expand the location, the time, and ideally to be 24/7 countywide.
Wonderful, yeah, and this just launched last week, so later on in today's talk, we'll definitely get into more of that, what I think is an exciting initiative for Madison. So kind of the first big topic I thought we could all get into today is about those accountability measures. And Chief, you mentioned you came here from Chicago with experience in Chicago's accountability or police oversight group there, and you came to Madison knowing that this work here was already underway. So what was your mindset coming into this job, knowing that a lot of that community work and those reform initiatives were taking off here? And sort of also as a chief, how do you envision yourself kind of working with and alongside those efforts here?
Sure. Well, coming here, I was extremely excited about the fact that there were recommendations and that the community had already began the process of looking at police departments and determining what do you want your police department to look like. I've always said that police departments should reflect the needs of the community and not the needs of the police. And that happens sometimes. And so I was very excited about that. Hopefully I won't embarrass my good friend Keith here, but I met Keith back in December. After I met the mayor, obviously, he was the first person that I reached out to because I'd already did the research on the recommendations. I thought, what a neat concept that we're already working towards it. Now, had they not done the recommendations, we would have gone through the process of creating our own. Because again, the police department has to reflect the needs of the community, and then there are sub-needs, right? Because each community has its own subculture that you have to take into account itself. With that being said, where we are now is we've just completed a RFP for a strategic planning company. So we have a company already selected, and they're going to come in for the purposes of taking all the recommendations, the ORI recommendations, the 177 recommendations, including recommendations from my own thought process and having done work with President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing, Pillar 6, which was employee safety and wellness. We want to take those recommendations along with new community input and try to put together a workable strategic plan. This strategic plan will be our way of holding ourselves accountable to our community. And so if there's a recommendation for training, for example, and that recommendation says that the police department will have cultural competency training or implicit bias training, we want to be able to show our community how we actually did that, when we did that, or if we haven't done it yet, then it's in the process, or quite frankly, if we failed, then we failed and we didn't meet that metric. And so I think that we have a very smart community here, a very strong community, and they deserve to know what their police department is doing in order to meet the needs of the community. The flip side of that is, when I read the recommendations, they were, really focused in on the police, and I think that's probably maybe not the way I would have done it, because there's an entire system out here. There's courts, corrections, and then cops, right? We call it the criminal justice system. And it's really unfair, I think, to judge one incident by what one group does. I really believe that if we want a criminal justice system, a policing system that's going to be fair and equitable to everyone, we have to start looking at the entire system. Because the truth is, we've known this from research, for some people, incarceration makes things worse. But if we don't have an alternative to that, what are we to do as police officers? We know that in some cases, in a lot of cases, when a police officer shows up to someone who's having a mental health crisis, it makes it worse. But if we have not looked at other alternatives to that, like we're doing with CARES and other things, then what we're doing is we're putting the police in a lose-lose situation. So I love the recommendations. I love the OII report. I love the 21st Century report on policing. But I still think there's more work to be done and look at this from a holistic standpoint.
Yeah, and sort of on that, when you think about this comprehensive approach then to criminal justice reform, so you're one person, you're the leader of the Madison Police Department, but there's many other entities, and maybe this is a question for the group here as well. But how does a community as a whole and all of these points in the criminal justice system work together to create some of this larger change when there are so many systems involved and a lot of embedded problems?
Well, I will just answer quickly. I will tell you from the standpoint of a criminologist, the last time that happened was the Kerner Commission, like back in the 60s, where they actually, after the Watts riots, stopped and said, hey, let's look at this entire system. And the things that they showed that were contributing to violence and crime were things not like arrest, it was housing. It was things like Ms. Grayson is working on. It was incarceration or de-incarceration. It was social services. It was a preschool. So we know this. We have a model for it. We just need to commit ourselves to doing this good work.
If I can jump in, I'll just say that
please.
I couldn't agree more with the chief about the sort of the holistic nature of the problem, the approach. Of course, the reason the ad hoc committee wrote up its 177 recommendations targeting the police was because that was the committee's charge from the city, not the. But that shouldn't be misunderstood to mean that that's the only place where reform is needed. And I agree completely with the chief on that. Some of it are things that the city itself can address, the mental health responses, the housing problems, things like that. Some of it is going to require some engagement with some other partners that the city does not control, the district attorney's office, the courts, and more broadly, state laws. We have problems that permeate the system and that are going to take some pretty broad approaches that go beyond what our city leaders alone can do. They can certainly apply pressure to address those. Let me also say one other thing about, if I can, about Chief Barnes's approach to transparency and community engagement. When we first issued our reports and created the Civilian Oversight Board and the Independent Monitor. And we were recruiting a police chief at that time. I was sometimes asked, what is this going to mean for a police chief coming in and facing these new entities, as if they would be a burden to the chief? And my response was, if I were the incoming chief, I would see that as a gift. As a gift, because one of the big problems we were trying to confront was the breakdown in trust and between the police department and many of Madison's communities, particularly low-income and marginalized communities. And we were creating a bridge between those entities, a way for the police to hear from those communities, for those communities to feel heard, for them to respond. And so I was thrilled when Chief Barnes came in and essentially said the same thing, that he viewed these these civilian oversight entities as something that really is to be desired.
Yeah, and you mentioned trust, and that's been an ongoing issue for not just the Madison Police Department, but for many institutions. And I know, Brandy, we had talked before about trust between the police department and I guess law enforcement as a whole, and the community. And I'm curious your perspective if you think some of these newer accountability measures will take a step forward in maybe repairing or building some of the trust that may be missing or broken.
Thank you. And I failed to introduce myself fully in the first question. After I listened to everyone else, I was like, dang, I guess I didn't say who I really am. So just for listeners and everyone, I am in the community in Dane County and Madison. I am known as an advocate for parents, organizer, activist. I am the antagonizer. I'm the person people call when they need assistance and someone to help them maneuver and navigate through systems. My specialty and my expertise is in white supremacy, patriarchal capitalism, understanding it as an insidious disease, really, and how it impacts all of our systems and institutions and how we interact with one another and how we see one another. So I just wanted to provide that context. And Abby, so your question is regarding the accountability measures. So, I'm a little biased, of course, right? So, and I really do come from the place of, in order for us to have true community engagement, we have to be able to deal with the power dynamics that's automatic within systems, right? So a lot of times, the answer to some of the heavy questions and challenges in our community, especially with police violence and community distrust or mistrust of police officers and the entire system, the answer often is community engagement. But how do you engage with a community that doesn't trust you? How do you engage with a community that sees you as the destroyer, that sees you as violent, that sees you as non-trustworthy, that sees you as the gatekeeper to white supremacy, right? So in order for us to have true community engagement, we actually have to deal with the elephant in the room, which is our systems, and especially our criminal justice systems with police officers and police departments on the front line of the system, right? The first contact is with police officers, which is why we need to really address, hold on one second. Sorry about that. So in order for us to really deal with our challenges within the criminal justice system, we have to deal with the first liners, which is police officers. They're the first people we have contact with. They decide whether or not you get a ticket or a warning or get arrested, right? So if they are deciding who goes to jail and who doesn't, then they are a big key to our challenges, right? Even before we get in front of the DA or we get in front of a judge, it's the police officer that has the discretion. They have the discretion to shoot or when they feel threatened, right? They have so much power and discretion. So I say that to say, if we're truly going to have real community engagement, we need our police officers, we need our chief of police, we need our sheriff department, we need people to really start having real conversations. And if we're gonna have real conversations, people have to educate themselves and really develop an analysis of how white supremacy racism shows up in the work. And the one thing that we teach in our work groups and all the consulting work that I do with organizations and institutions is that we have to move away from defining white supremacy racism based on race, because it has nothing to do with race. We have a new Black chief of police, right? He's Black, and people are really excited about that, and I'm excited about that. And at the same time, we have to be able to understand that it's not his color that decides how our system changes, not at all, because as people known as Black, we still embody white supremacy traits, attributes, and understanding. So we not only embody it, we project it out. And oftentimes within system where there's a huge power dynamic, specifically within police departments and civilians, when you're a non-white person, right? When you're a Black person or a non-white person, you also, the need to show people who's in charge is also compounded, because you're working within a system that discriminates against you and shows racism against you, and that's quick to reprimand you versus your counterparts who are white. And then you put these police officers in our community and you say, but they're Black, and then they have their own issues with inside the systems, and they come out and they treat us like crap, right? So there's so many different dynamics. So I say that again to say, if we're going to have true accountability, we have to really start digging up the root and being willing to work on our individual self and all the attributes of white supremacy that shows up within self, that gets projected out when we interact with, community members. And it doesn't matter if you're a police officer, a chief, a sheriff, a teacher, a doctor, or nurse. This stuff shows up and it's real, right? So I say that, and I will also add to the accountability measures, we can't deal with politics, right? So everyone wants the ad hoc, and I'm really grateful for our ad hoc committee and all the folks who put in years of work, right? Years and years of work. I appreciate all of you guys. And we're right back to the start, right? We're within systems trying to get systems to do something systems are not even programmed to do, right? We want them to have a community oversight. We have a community oversight committee ran by and overseen by our mayor office. That's incongruent to freedom and, right, outside of politics. We're going to have a auditor, a monitor person who will be then managed by the city and the mayor office, who is in partnership with the police department, because the city of Madison needs to have a certain look. And with that certain look comes a lot of politics, and we must get along, right? We can't go against one another. Police department will, say some things about, have, and not currently, but have said some things about the mayor, and the mayor, of course, will, have dropped videos and supported police officers and turned around and said something else. So there's a lot of politics, and what we have to do is really get down to the root. And accountability means that we need a whole system outside of the system to monitor the system. So that's what I'll say in there. Thank you, Abby.
Yeah, thank you, Brandy, for, excuse me, take a sip of water here. Thank you for sharing all of that. And we are just about at our break. And then I'd love to turn the table over to you for a bit more follow-up questions on these accountability measures. Thank you so much.
We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.
Well, welcome back, everyone. So let's continue the conversation. So Keith, I wanted to turn to you just about the progress on the hiring for the actual monitor and how that's been going. I know a deadline was pushed back, and wanted to see if you had insight into how that's been going.
I haven't seen the applications. It was pushed back just to broaden the pool a little bit. My understanding is, I forget the exact number, but I think we have somewhere in the neighborhood of a dozen or more applicants who meet the minimum qualifications, and now it's going to go through a multi-stage process, starting with they'll be given some oral board exam. It's essentially an exam that they have to pass to move on to the next stage and whatnot. So I haven't seen the applicants. I can't tell you what the quality is yet, but I'm really, really hopeful that we have some good people in there. And I just wanted to say to Brandy, thank you very much for raising all of those really important issues. And you hit it right on the head when you said the problem is how do you create engagement with a community that doesn't trust you, that is the problem, and that's one of the things that our committee was attentive to in trying to figure out how to solve that conundrum. And the Civilian Oversight Board was intended to do that so that, for example, well, the board has significant opportunities for policy input, for evaluating discipline, or a wide range of things. And the board was deliberately set up to include voices that often are not heard in policing discussions. So it is made up primarily of individuals nominated for appointment by a select group of community groups representing these often not heard voices. And so it's a very unusual mix of people in that regard. The only thing I would say is to correct one thing that Brandy said, and that is that at least structurally, the board and the monitor are not, they were set up in a way to avoid capture by the political process. So they do not answer to the mayor, and they do not answer, and neither the independent monitor nor the Civilian Oversight Board. The city's actually kind of struggled to figure out how to work this, because the board is insulated from that. They don't answer to the mayor at all, or to the Common Council once they've been appointed. And as I said, the vast majority are nominated by community groups. And the independent monitor is then hired by the Civilian Oversight Board and answers to the Civilian Oversight Board, not the mayor at all. So we have had zero input from the mayor or the Common Council in our deliberations so far. So will that work in the end? I don't know, but I hope so. But it's trying to be responsive and attentive to some of the concerns that Brandy has raised.
Yeah, and I think that independence is a critical piece to that recommendation, and a key part of building that trust. And of course, this is a brand new thing for Madison, so I mean, I certainly will be curious to see how it all plays out. So we have another important topic I really want to talk about, which is the CARES initiative. And so, Sarah, I'd love to turn it to you. So you told us a little bit about, sort of the goals behind it and some of the brief bullet points about how it works. But I'd love to, hear a bit more about how it's been going these past few days. It launched, I believe, last Wednesday, September 1st. Do you have any, stories, feedback on how these first few days have been going?
Sure. So again, CARE stands for Community Alternative Response Emergency Services. This is intended to be a mobile crisis response team that is sent out by 911 dispatch center to respond to behavioral health related calls for service that come into 911. So some of the things that we talked about in the development of this was wanting to be true to that goal of just providing another alternative within the continuum of emergency response. So one of the questions that we've had a lot is this a team that the community could access directly without going to through the 911 center? And that may change in the future, but for now, it is just in response to 911 calls for service. And there's a specific reason for that, which is that a lot of times when someone is experiencing a behavioral health crisis or calling on behalf of someone who is, they don't know where to call to get help, and everybody knows 911 is an emergency number, and so that's where people kind of logically call, and we want to have an alternative for how we respond to those calls. So again, that's something that may change. We may modify that in the future, but for now we really wanted to keep it specific to that. So on the first day, Wednesday, September 1st was our launch day. They went into service over the radio, and there was this kind of high anticipation moment for all of us, sort of standing around waiting for that first call to come in, and I think in my head it was going to happen at 11:01 a.m., but that was not the case. So there was a little bit of kind of downtime and just talking about how, how the team will work logistically, how they will, how the workflow will look. One of the things that we're examining is allowing the team to do some follow-up with individuals that they've responded to, because we don't want it to be just a matter of coming in and responding to a crisis and backing away and not necessarily ensuring that there is some warm handoff or connection to appropriate resources that the person might need. So the team currently consists of 2 paramedics and 2 journey crisis workers. We have 1 CARES vehicle, a van, that has the logo on it, and when the team is dispatched, 1 paramedic and 1 crisis worker will go in response to calls. So the other team that's not actively out on calls will have the opportunity to do some follow-up, maybe with someone that they had contact with the day before, for example, to call and check in how they're doing. Were they able to, connect to a service that they were trying to access at the time of the contact when they were in crisis the day before, that sort of thing. So far with only a few days under our belt, we've had, a handful of calls that they've gone out on that have been, in my opinion, very appropriate for this team. People who are in a behavioral health crisis. A couple of the folks that they've responded to are folks that were already known to Journey, that we've responded to them being in a crisis in the past. None of the calls required police to become involved. There is that, that opportunity for fluidity on these calls. So what I mean by that is if police are dispatched to something that perhaps at the outset, when the call taker in the 911 center is taking information, might sound like law enforcement is needed, but then officers respond and find that, no, this seems to be more of a mental health crisis, and it appears to be a safe scene for civilian personnel to enter into, and they might call to see, could the CARES team come and respond to this? And conversely, if the CARES team is dispatched to something and it turns out that there is a safety issue that requires law enforcement response, which could range from, there's weapons involved, to even things like scene safety. Like we talked about the example of if an individual who was in crisis was, maybe in the middle of East Washington Avenue, and there's a lot of traffic, and we need officers to control traffic around the scene so that the responders can safely assist the person, that sort of thing. So, we want to have fluidity so that we can make sure that we're sending the right response to the right situation at the right time. And so far, that seems to have been going really well in these first few days. The examples that we have been really appropriate for that.
Yeah, it's great to hear that it's been going well, and I'm curious to see how it continues to operate. This could be a question for the group as a whole, but I mean, just how important is it that Madison has this emergency responder initiative that doesn't involve an armed police officer? I mean, that feels pretty important to me, and I'm curious, your response just on sort of the magnitude of what this initiative means for Madison. So anyone can jump in.
I'll jump in. I'm super excited. I'm super excited for this new program. And I'm really grateful for all the people that kept on advocating for it and pushing the envelope to get this done. And one of the things I always go back to is education, right? We can develop all the systems and all the processes in the world that benefit our people. And if the folks that we have responding to situations aren't doing the inner work to deal with those attributes that I continue to talk about, then what we have is another system doing the same thing as the last system or institution. So it's important that the educational piece is there, and it's education provided that's outside of social constructs or traditional diversity and inclusion education. And just to respond to what Keith said about the politics being out of the oversight committee, I totally hear that. And we all know how politics work, right? So we know that the mayor appointed her people, that her people end up being appointed like in charge or in positions of power within the oversight. So politics is a mess, and we all know that. So I respect all the work and the efforts, and I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
I'll say I think I'm very excited about the CARES program, and one reason, driving a police car is part of police work. But we don't ask police to change the oil in the car because there's probably someone better to do that than we. Responding to people in mental health crisis has been a part of police work, but there's probably someone better to do that. And so now we have a group who will do that on those calls that aren't dangerous or that do not involve a firearm or some other type of dangerous tool. But it's important to note that as we look at police reform, Obviously, I don't like the reimagining police because, let's just fix it. We don't really have to reimagine it. Let's fix it. But one of the things that we need to do to fix police is we need to look at what are those things that we're asking our police officers to do, and who is best to do this job function. And if it's someone other than us, I'm okay with that, because number one, that's what our community wants, and number two, it helps get that person what they need. And I'm really big on the this false narrative that people with mental health crisis are dangerous, and that's really not true. They're more likely to be victims than they are to be assailants, and I think this is a good way of re-educating our public on what works best in this type of situation. So I wish you guys all the luck and success that you can have, and we're certainly here to help you if you need us.
I'll just quickly join in by saying I completely agree with what's been said about the enthusiasm for a program like this. It's exactly the kind of thing that the ad hoc committee was recommending, and moving some of police functions away from someone carrying a gun and representing the authority of physical force to someone who's trained to deal with mental health problems is absolutely the best thing for everyone.
And so this program is new to Madison, of course, but there are similar programs across the country. So, Sarah, what do we know about similar programs that have been operating for quite some time? What outcomes are they seeing, and are those some outcomes you would like this pilot program to see?
Absolutely, and there was a lot of research done into these other programs in modeling or developing a model for Madison's CARES program. So I think the one that is kind of most commonly heard of is called CAHOOTS in Eugene, Oregon, but there are several others around the country. I think CAHOOTS may be the original. It's one of the most established or well-known. And what CAHOOTS and other programs have found is that they have reduced the number of police calls for service related to mental health. They have reduced visits to ERs, reduced number of arrests, reduced incidents of violence, all the outcomes that we can all agree are what we want in our community. And I think kind of going back to, I've said this a couple times now, but what I really want to focus on, and what the purpose of CARES is to expand that continuum of crisis response, so that when people are needing an emergency response, they know that there are options available. There are many times when we at the crisis unit at Journey here have conversations with someone who is concerned about someone in a mental health crisis, and this was especially crystallized for me during COVID, when kind of all the resources, at least initially when COVID hit, were really pulled back and people were kind of left to their own devices, but police were still responding. And it left a lot of people feeling like, is this our only option for getting help, is to have police sent to our door, and that's not necessarily something that we want. And so this is kind of an answer to that, and a way to say that there are different ways to handle emergencies. And I appreciate Chief making the point about that a person with a mental illness is much more likely to be a victim of violence than a perpetrator of violence. And there can be some extremely unsafe situations associated with a person whose judgment is impaired by mental illness or by drug or alcohol use or things like that. So, we want to keep an eye towards safety with these programs, and everything that we have looked at with the programs that are established have had zero or very low number of incidents of safety concerns for the staff, or somebody being injured, or kind of the wrong response being sent to a call that results in someone being injured or killed or something like that. So I think that speaks really highly of how we can do this right when we put those resources in place.
And now this is a pilot program, so when will the city know what happens next? If this will continue permanently, if it will expand? What can you tell us about that timeline?
I can't tell you much about the timeline. I can say I think I used the word pilot myself. It's just kind of a natural word to come to mind. But what I dislike about that word is that it sort of has a connotation of being temporary, or we're going to try this out and see what we think. And I feel pretty confident that the city and the community stakeholders involved in this are committed to making this work, to keeping it in place and expanding it. I would be incredibly surprised if that was not the case. As far as the timeline for what that looks like, I don't know. We do have a person within the city's IT department that is going to be helping us with data, looking at calls for service that the team is responding to, calls for service that they could have responded to if they were available, outcomes of the calls, all of those kinds of things, to help us really learn as we go, so that we can make the program as effective as possible and make really smart decisions about when and where to expand that is going to most closely meet the needs.
Definitely. Yeah, I know I spoke with some people representing county supervisor areas, and I know that they were interested in hoping that this type of program could expand to, go beyond the city of Madison and potentially address kind of more rural parts of the county. So
Yes.
I think that'll be a topic hopefully we can all be talking about soon.
That would be great.
Yeah, so moving on and kind of looking back a little bit at last summer, of course, when there were many protests here in Madison and across the country, officers here, including, those from agencies outside of Dane County that came to Madison to respond, including the Wisconsin National Guard, used pepper spray and chemical agents and, reacted to many of the activities downtown during those protests. And so I believe that response is currently under review by the Quattrone Center at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So I wanted to check in with Keith and the chief as well, who I think are involved in this, just on what that review process is like and what do we know so far and what happens after the review is complete.
Yeah, you were on the committee, so.
Okay, sure. So the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Law School was awarded a federal grant from the U.S. Department of Justice to be a technical assistance provider on what they call Sentinel event reviews. And what these are basically processes whereby an organization goes through a learning process after a Sentinel event, meaning any kind of an incident. It might be a wrongful conviction, it might be an officer-involved shooting. In this case, Madison asked the Quattrone Center to bring their expertise and their process to do a review of the police department's response to the protests that occurred in the wake of the George Floyd killing last spring, summer, and early fall. And the idea behind these reviews is to sort of look at these Sentinel events, these as in some respect or another a system failure, and it's. But what I have to say that very carefully, because the idea is that it's a non-blaming review. So it's a system failure, not in the sense that it prejudges that anybody did anything wrong, but in the sense that things happened that we would rather they hadn't happened, right? Nobody wants the use of pepper spray and whatnot on crowds, as an example. And so it's kind of like a National Transportation Safety Board review, where they come in after the fact, not looking for someone to blame, but to figure out what happened, what made this occur, and what can we learn from that so that we can tweak systems in the future so that we're less likely to have negative outcomes. And so the Quattrone Center has been undergoing that process. They brought together an advisory committee of stakeholders ranging from law enforcement officers to community representatives. I am one of the people involved in that as well. And we have been painstakingly going over the police reports, the surveillance videos of the incidents on that date, and trying to, again, the blame may be there. We may decide that somebody did something wrong, but we're looking for bigger, more systemic things. What could the police have done differently? What could community groups have done differently? What were the contributing factors? So the next time we have this kind of incident, we're less likely to see those kind of confrontations that contribute to building that distrust in some of our communities. The draft report has been written by the staff at the Quattrone Center. It's in my inbox waiting to be read, but I can't tell you what's in it because I haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's brand new.
Chief, is there anything you'd like to add about that review process?
Yes, I'll just add that, it was the police department that reached out to the center and said, hey, can you do a review of what happened so that we can improve? One of our core values is continuous improvement. And I will tell you, coming from the world of policing, that does not happen often. Usually police departments, when something is done, they want to move away from it as fast as they can. They want to, sometimes they apologize, sometimes they don't, usually they don't, and they just want to turn the page. But that's not the case here at the Madison Police Department. We wanted to take a look at what happened last year and where we can improve or do better. I do have the report. My plan for the report is, once it's finalized, having some of the members of the actual group come forward and do a presentation for our leadership and also for our community, and then think about what systems changes that we need to make in order to prevent this from happening again. And then, most importantly, is there any part of reconciliation that we can do as a community to ensure that this doesn't happen again? Certainly, Madison wasn't the only city who had protests last year, but I think where we're missing an opportunity is to reconcile with our community. Because for me, the George Floyd protests were about more than just the killing of George Floyd. That started it, but it's about more than that. It's about a system where people don't think that it works the same for everyone. It's about a system where people think that we overvalue some of the small things and some things are let go. It's about not only a criminal justice system, but a government that some people don't see works fairly for everyone. We, as police, we're the most visible form of government. You know who we are by what we have on. But the person who's responsible for not fixing the pothole in your street, and now you've got a flat tire, and now you can't go to work, and now you're late, you don't know that person when they pass you on the street, but they know us. And so there's a lot of frustrations. That's just one example. But there are a lot of frustrations that people carried last year that I was aware of down in Salisbury, where I walked with protesters. We had, going back to the 60s, these meetings where you all kind of sit in circles and you kind of talk about what's going on. I sat and knelt with protesters, listened to them, because I understood that it was much bigger than simply the killing of George Floyd, which was terrible. It shocked the conscience of everyone that I know of. But there's more to it than that, and I'm hoping that the Catrone report will be a great avenue for us to look at some of that community reconciliation and how to move forward.
Yeah, and when I think about the protests of last summer, and then I also think about what all is happening here in Madison. Like, how do those two work together? Did the protests of last summer, the response that the community saw from law enforcement, in any way sort of affect potentially the implementation or the future success of some of these accountability measures? Were steps taken backward, I guess, last summer in terms of that trust that we've been talking about that's so important?
I think the recommendations had happened before the protests. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so they had happened before, and obviously we had an interim chief of police, so he was managing what was going on there. But I can just say that if I was here, it would not have stopped us, because I'm still committed to listening to my community. I'm still committed to listening to all voices and raising those voices that, quite frankly, have been ignored by the criminal justice system for a very, very long time. And so, yes, it certainly didn't move things forward, but it does create an opportunity to have further conversations about what do we do the next time this happens. When I was down in Salisbury, when George Floyd happened, we spoke about it. We didn't wait until people decided to take to the streets. I made sure that my voice was clear and that I said, listen, this is wrong. This is not what we do here. And these are the things that we do. This is how we're trained. These are our values to ensure that this doesn't happen. And then we saw some communities having policies, duty to intervene, which kind of blew my mind. I said, you don't have this already? And most police departments, I think, had a policy, but policies are only as good as the people who follow them and hold persons accountable. So I'm glad that some police departments have those policies, but it's about more than that. It's about using it as an opportunity to move forward with community trust, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So with the time we have left, I wanted to ask a bigger future forward-looking question to all of you here. And that is, given all these initiatives, policies, and considerations we've been talking about today, and that Madison itself has been talking about for many years, how would each of you define a successful next 5 years for policing in Madison? What does that look like for you? And I'll let anyone start, and we can all chime in.
I guess I will start, because I think somebody wants to go last, but I'll go ahead and start. So for me, success for policing in Madison is having a police department that truly reflects our community. We need to do better with hiring. We need to do better with diversity. We need to have a police department that is non-racist, right? They say, I don't want a police department that's racist. We need a police department that's anti-racist. There's a difference between being non and being anti. And what I mean by that is I want our community to know that we stand against certain things. And you do that by the policies that you have, and you do that by the way you show up. And so when we show up, it's clear to everyone that we're here for your best interest. And that may mean, hey, I'm not the best person to handle this call. Have you heard about our carers? Well, they're busy. Okay, well, is there anything that we can do until they're not busy to help you out, right? And these are the things that I think will be successful. We need to build a police department and a community that is hopeful about change. Being pessimistic about all of the problems that we have is really not going to get it done. When it comes to trust, there are more problems than solutions. But I am up for the task. I am excited about being here. And if I'm not anything else, I'm tough and I'm hopeful about we can have a police department that's a national model for exceptional policing. That's my goal.
Anyone can go next.
Just to fill this
I'll just jump in and just
Okay.
say that was amazing, Chief. Everything that he said is on par and is on point. So I just want to acknowledge that. And to me, 5 years from now, a successful police department, you know, as an abolitionist, you know, technically I don't believe in policing. And I'll add the and, right, because it's where we're at. This is what we have right now. But everything that the chief said and partnerships, right? We need real partnerships. We need partnerships. Urban Triage needs partnerships with the Madison Police Department, real ones where we're engaged in providing education, right? Consulting work, real partnerships that relates to the school district that's outside of these contracts that say that when, you know, a social worker or a teacher can't get a kid to stop talking, right? They call the police, but we're doing something different than that, right? That the relationships between the Madison School District and the parents and the students is outside of or reflect this effort that's like, let's not move from a place of paternalism, domination, arrest, and this trajectory, you know, this trajectory to the school to prison pipeline, but more so of from a humanity place, right? A humanity-centered place. And I get at the same time, police have to be trained to protect themselves, and they could do the and, we can do the and in partnership. You can learn how to protect yourself and see the humanity in other people and see Black children like you would see your own children, right? It's because, you know, outside of the way they look or talk or this facade that a lot of our children give off because they're hurting, right? Because as the chief pointed out, this isn't just an issue with police department. This is an issue in our whole design of our society, right? Parents have to work 2 or 3 jobs, no community supports, no opportunity, no resources, high rent, low wages. We don't have much to offer our children except for prison. So in true partnerships with the city, the county, school districts, and grassroots organizations, that would reflect a police department that's headed on the right direction as it relates to humanity. Thank you.
If we still have time, I'll just jump in and say that, you know, in 2015, when the city appointed the ad hoc committee, we started down this path of reform, but also of building trust and engagement with all of Madison's communities. And so my vision for the police department in 5 years would be to see the continuation of that process and the realization of the recommendations that were set into place at that point, which means a fully functioning and effective civilian oversight board that truly represents the voices of the over-policed and all segments of our community in a constructive relationship with the police that helps the police do the job better, a movement away from calling on police to do everything, to solve every problem in our community, and to get to a point ultimately where we are able to develop the kind of trust and transparency that means that every member of our community, even the most marginalized currently, not only feels that they're treated safely by the police, but feels confident in the police so that they trust them enough to call them when they are in need of help.
Thank you.
I know we're over on the time, so I'll just say really quickly, even a broader scope than policing, I think as a community, one thing that happens when there is a crisis like COVID, nobody would wish that on our society ever, and yet things that we recognized as a problem before COVID, for example, the urgency of having a better place for homeless men to shelter at night. Everybody knew that the men's homeless shelter was, wholly inadequate and frankly inhumane place for people to stay. But COVID added urgency to it and made it a necessity that we make a change. So my analogy to that is I think there are a lot of things that we can look at and say, well, we're making improvements on this and we see, a future that we want in this area. This CARES team, adds another element to our continuum of emergency response. And these are all good successes and steps forward. And I hope that as a community that we never kind of sit back and say, okay, now we've done that, we're all good. That we are always looking at these types of ways to make improvements, to recognize how we can do better, how we can serve all of our community members better, how we can do that in a way that is respectful of everybody in our community, and never thinking that it's something that we've achieved, but it's always a process that we're continuing to improve.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for being here today and for being a part of this year's Cap Times Idea Fest. Thank you so much.
We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.